On the wall of my study at home, I have a very special piece of art. It's very special to me. It is a framed, counted thread embroidery of a picture of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. It's exceptionally detailed, beautifully executed, and it depicts Jesus holding a rod, your rod and staff, they come from, holding a rod, feeding a sheep, with the walls of old Jerusalem in the background. The play of light in the many different threads is quite extraordinary. Now, I am not a person who is usually into religious art, depictions of Jesus, but this one is particularly special to me because it was stitched over many, many hours by my mum as a labour of love for me. And as beautiful as it is, I have often wondered, as I sit in my chair to say my prayers, it's on the wall opposite me, I have often wondered how close to reality it is in its depiction of the shepherd. Like the shepherd that's in the window behind me, if you look at it on your way out this morning, Jesus, the shepherd, in my picture, is a little bit too clean. It's a little bit too saccharine. The sheep is too white and too fluffy, and the setting is too serene. Because you see, shepherding in the ancient world was a rough and tumble affair. In fact, one scholar suggests that the Bible is the only piece of ancient literature that depicts shepherding in a positive light. No one else does. Derek Tidball, who was principal of the London Bible College, says this. He says, shepherds had a dubious reputation. They were judged to be constitutionally dishonest. People were forbidden to buy anything from them because it was bound to have been stolen. They were not accepted as witnesses in court because they would almost certainly be unreliable. Furthermore, their lifestyle prevented them from worshipping regularly at the temple, so they were considered to be among the unclean. But of course, the history of this metaphor in the Bible is a long and rich one and redeemed by its association. Great King David was a shepherd boy. God himself is depicted as the shepherd of his people. The most famous word picture of this is in Psalm 23, read at many a funeral because of its tender image. The Lord is my shepherd, David writes, taking me to green pastures and still waters and safely along the paths protected by his shepherd's rod and staff. All of this and more is behind our text today from John chapter 10. In Palestine in the first century, every family had a sheep pen. And the sheep would be gathered into the pen overnight for their safety from their natural predators, mostly wolves, and from those who might steal them. And each day, the shepherd, perhaps a boy or two girls hired from the local village, would come at sunup and open the gate of the sheep pen and call out the sheep to follow them to the pastures around the village on the nearby hills. They would lead them on safe pathways, away from danger, towards good pasture and water to drink, and they would protect them. Sometimes a village would have a communal pen, and everybody's sheep would be mixed in together at night. Your sheep and your sheep and your sheep, all in there together. And in the morning the shepherd would come and call his particular sheep, his little flock, and they would know his voice and follow only him out the gate into the grazing lands. Then the next shepherd would come and call out his sheep, and they would follow him. And in fact, the shepherd would give the individual sheep names. Most of them, you see, were bred for wool and not for meat, so you could have a relationship with them that wasn't going to end in tears. And he would call them by name from the group, and they would follow him out. Only a thief would avoid the gate and climb over the wall into the pen. Sometimes, if you were a shepherd in Palestine in the first century, a mobile enclosure would be made in the field. If the grazing fields were a little bit further away from the town, you'd build some rocks into a circle, you put some briars around the top to stop the animals, the predators climbing over into it, and there'd be a little opening on one side. And the shepherd would sleep in the opening overnight to protect the sheep as a kind of human gateway. Now, we all know, maybe from personal experience, I woke up this morning and there were sheep outside my window where I'm staying, or maybe from watching muster dogs, or watching the sheep trials at Agfest in Tasmania. To the something of May, you must come, it's wonderful. We know that sheep in Australia are driven from behind, don't we? The stockman, with his dogs, rounds up the sheep and drives them forward. But in Israel, even today, the shepherds do it differently. They lead their sheep, and the sheep follow the voice of the shepherd and his call. And occasionally he might throw a stone back to get them into line on the outside of the sheep, but sheep follow the shepherd. Being a shepherd, while not glamorous or given to a good reputation, was a highly personal occupation. A shepherd sometimes spending many years with the same small flock of sheep, knowing them as well as you might know your dog or your cat. You're not very smart, dog or cat, as we know sheep aren't smart. Now, everyone knew this. So when Jesus told this parable, everybody understood the context. They understood that he was talking about sheep, even though they didn't quite understand its meaning. I want you to notice a few things about what we've read from John chapter 10 this morning. And the foundation thing that we have to know as we hear Jesus speaking about shepherding to the people, first to the Pharisees and then to his disciples, the first thing we need to know is we are sheep. The extended metaphor in John 10, the people of God are the sheep. This has always been the case in the Bible. Psalm 100 verse 3 says, "Know that the Lord is God, it is he who made us, and we are his people, the sheep of his pasture." It's not the most flattering of descriptions given what we know, is it? You see, sheep are not so bright. They're prone to wandering, they're prone to tracking with the group, they're prone to getting into trouble, they're prone to getting lost and tangled in the thorns, and they are not very reliable. But if we're honest with ourselves, perhaps this is not such a bad description of us after all. I don't know about you, but this perfectly describes my heart. Prone to wander, prone to be distracted by the most recent delight, going with what the group thinks, sometimes getting lost and entangled in things that are not good for me. It's appropriate, isn't it, in Isaiah 53 that the prophet says, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way." You see it in the fields, you see it in your life, I see it in mine. And it's highly appropriate, isn't it, that the parable of the lost sheep in Luke 15 is a parable about our salvation. I once was lost, and now I'm found. So if we know this, then John 10 has a particular appropriateness about it, doesn't it? So as sheep, what do we need to know? First, beware of false shepherds. See, Jesus began this discussion with a parable directed at the Pharisees. You see that in verse 1, don't you? Very truly, you Pharisees, very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate but climbs in by some other way is a thief and a robber. Jesus was directing this at the Pharisees about false shepherds who climb over the fence to steal and whose voice is not recognised by the sheep. He knew that these Pharisees were prone to putting burdens on the people of God that they were weights that they could not bear. The Pharisees loaded people up with rules and regulations that robbed people of true salvation. They pretended to be shepherds, but they were not. And I'm sure that Jesus had in mind the famous Old Testament passage from Ezekiel 34 of the failure of the leaders of Israel to shepherd their people. The prophet was scathing there in his condemnation of the shepherds of Israel. Listen to what he says in Ezekiel 34. He says, "Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not care for the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally." Ezekiel says to the shepherds of Israel in his day, "You're more like butchers than you are like shepherds." Now Jesus is riffing off this idea in John chapter 10. We've just read in the chapter before there about their opposition to Jesus healing the blind man. Later in John 10 they'll pick up stones to stone Jesus for blasphemy. These so-called leaders of Israel are not leading at all. They are not shepherds. Their voices are not recognised by the sheep because they speak against the words of God. Beware false shepherds. Sadly, we don't have to look far to realise not much has changed in our world. False shepherds continue to draw sheep away from the teaching and words of Jesus. People who pretend to be a shepherd but are climbing in over the fence. They climb in via the walls and lead people astray. Just this week, I heard a false shepherd, a world Christian leader, I won't name him, but I heard him telling people that Buddhism, Hinduism and Christianity were all just different paths to the one destination. All roads lead to God, he said. That is a voice we do not recognise. That is a voice of a shepherd who is leading people astray. False shepherds are the ones who preach cheap grace. Bonhoeffer said this, "Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate." There are those in the Church of England today and the Anglican Church of Australia today who would happily lead us away from the clear teaching of Christ about marriage and human sexuality. And so we need to continue to be on our guard. Be on our guard against the false shepherds who climb in over the wall and lead sheep astray. So that's the first thing. But this passage has so much good news for us because it also tells us that we have a good shepherd, and the good shepherd is Jesus. First of all, in verse 7, he says, "I am the gate. No one enters or exits the sheepfold but by me, by my say-so." We know what that means, don't we? There he is, lying in the gateway of the mobile pen in the middle of the field, protecting his sheep. That's you and me from the predators that come, from the false shepherds, from the wolves, from the attackers of the evil one. Jesus is there, keeping us safe, protecting and defending us, his sheep. He's saying that he is the one that gives us access to the pasture land that will nourish us. Contrary to that false shepherd I talked about just a moment, who is teaching that all paths lead to God, Jesus says, I am the gate. You only get to the pasture. You only get to salvation through me. He alone is the sole way that people enter this pasture, this salvation. Unlike the false shepherds and thieves that only want their personal gain and reputation, he has come so that people might find life in all its fullness, he says, find full satisfaction. One writer put it, to be fat, contented, flourishing sheep. That's what he wants for us. It's a wonderful metaphor for our spiritual life, isn't it? A spiritual life that is fat and contented and flourishing. And that's especially because this shepherd, this good shepherd, he says, is prepared to lay down his life for the sheep. Did you notice in our reading that Jesus mentions this not once or twice, but 4 times in our passage, that he is prepared to lay down his life for the sheep? Remember I mentioned a few minutes ago Ezekiel 34, that prophecy against the false shepherds of Israel, the bad shepherds of Israel, the leaders of Israel who only took care of themselves? Later in Ezekiel 34, we read these words of God's future plan. Listen to this. It's amazing. The sovereign Lord says, this is from the prophet Ezekiel, the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I, the Lord, will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places they were scattered on the day of clouds and darkness. I'll search for the lost and bring back the strays. I'll bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. I'll shepherd the flock with justice. And in verse 33 he says this, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Isn't that wonderful? The prophet Ezekiel tells of this day, the day when Jesus would come and be the good shepherd. Because we know that Jesus is presented in the New Testament as the great King David's greater son. And he is the shepherd that God described there in Ezekiel 34. And this good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Of course, you know what that means in shepherding, don't you? The shepherd puts his life on the line to save the sheep. He fights off the wild beasts and puts his life at risk for them. But we also know what the disciples and Pharisees couldn't know in John chapter 10, that Jesus would lay down his life for them by dying on the cross, for the sins of the sheep, the waywardness of the sheep, so that we could find salvation, the pasture, the full life of satisfaction that is on offer. And so you don't think that Jesus' death was just a confluence of bad events. He tells us in verse 18 that he will lay down his life of his own accord. This was his plan, to give his life for us, his sheep. You see, the good shepherd knows his sheep. He speaks, and if we're his sheep, we recognise his voice. And he knows us by name. The Palestinian shepherd would call his sheep by name. This one's big ears, this one's grumpy, this one's scruffy, this one's stubborn boy, this one's blunt nose. And now we're told that Jesus calls us his sheep by name. And I wonder what nickname he has for me and for you. Maybe he calls us Old Fearful, Faithless, Proud, Softy. He knows who you are. He knows you, not just your name and your nickname, but have a look at this. Did you notice in verses 14 and 15? He says, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Get this, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. Did you get that? That is a staggering statement. Just as the Father knows Jesus, and Jesus knows the Father, that's how intimately he knows each one of us. He numbers the hairs on my head. He calls me by name. He knows what makes me afraid. He knows what makes me joyful and inspired and greedy and lustful and disobedient and sometimes faithful and fruitful and wonderful. And he loves me just the same. And he does the same for you. And he expects that you and I will know him and know his voice and follow where he leads and eat from the pasture lands that he provides for us. See, the relationship he describes here between sheep and shepherd is a two-way relationship. My dependence on him and his provision for me. Because our good shepherd lays down his life for us and takes it up again for us in the resurrection, and thereby gives us forgiveness and restoration and a new beginning and a promise of a future and a sure and certain hope. And did you notice that we Aussies are included specifically in this text? Did you get this? Verse 16, he says, I have other sheep that are not of this pen. I must bring them in also. You see, when Jesus was teaching his disciples, he knew that he was going to extend his ministry to the Gentiles. And if you are here today not of Hebrew origin, if you are not one of the sheep of Israel, then this verse is about you. It's about me. This is Jesus' mission, calling the whole world, even Australians, into his fold. I think there's one question that this passage raises for us this morning, and that is, do you know the shepherd? Do you know the shepherd? The true shepherd? The good shepherd? Have you heard him call your name? Have you looked up and said, I know that voice. I'll follow him wherever he leads. Because you can. And you can hear his voice in his words. And you can get to know him in this gospel, in this story. And you can lean on him and depend on him and follow him. And he will show you the way. Did you notice at the very end, this whole thing divided the crowd? Look at verse 19. The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, he's demon-possessed and raving mad, why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Of course, the answer is no. Who will you join? The ones who say he's mad, or the ones who choose to follow the Good Shepherd? Let's pray. Oh, Father, thank you. Thank you for being our shepherd. Thank you for calling us sheep. Thank you for sending your Son as the Good Shepherd. Today, may we hear his voice and follow him. Amen.